Um, with us on the panel today, we have my colleague Marwa Fatafta, who is Access Now's Middle East and North Africa Policy and Advocacy Director. We also have Sarah Chander, who is the co-founder of the Equinox Racial Justice Initiative. We have Dr. Matt Mahmoudi, who is Assistant Professor in Digital Humanities at Cambridge University and leads Amnesty International's research and advocacy on AI-driven surveillance. And we have Lydia DeLeu, who is Strategic Litigation Lead at SOMO, the Center for Research on Multinational Corporations. I'd also just like to thank the European AI and Society Fund for the support that made this panel possible. And before we get into the topic of the panel, I want to talk about something which is unfortunately quite related to the topic of the panel, which is the attempt to make us change things in the title and in the panel description. Many of you will have seen that those of us involved in this panel, as well as the participants of the other panel on Palestine, organized by Dr. Mais Kandil, published a statement to condemn the pressure we were put under by CPDP to remove the term genocide and other words from our title and panel description. Since the title and description of this panel were published online in April, we faced pressure around the use of three terms: genocide, war crimes, and atrocities. And I want to begin by saying that this panel will not be about debating that terminology. We will devote our time here to discuss, we won't devote our time here today to discuss the attempts to stop us talking, but rather speak about what we came here to speak about. People, including children, journalists, aid workers, are being killed en masse, starved and deprived of their basic human rights. While states, institutions, academics and others are debating terms and failing to take basic, concrete actions to stop these atrocities. Genocide is the crime of all crimes. The first article of the Genocide Convention states that it is a crime under international law which states must prevent and punish. Multiple experts and organizations, including UN special rapporteurs and renowned experts on genocide, have concluded that what Israel is doing in Gaza amounts to genocide, not to mention the well-documented litany of war crimes and crimes against humanity, to which both the Israeli Prime Minister and his former Defense Minister are currently wanted for by the ICC. And while the ICJ is looking into the case of genocide brought forward by South Africa, the question we must now raise and discuss: what have both states and companies done to ensure they prevent the crime of genocide, given the multiple warnings and the pending case before the ICJ? Moreover, how can we ensure as a collective here, a collective of people that cares about digital rights, about human rights, how can we ensure that the new AI-enabled tactics of warfare that we are seeing unleashed in Gaza do not become the new norm amid the increasing and rapid militarization of tech and the erosion of rights? What we now want to talk about as the specific focus of this panel is the role of technology companies, and in that context also the European Union and its member states, in facilitating the genocidal actions of Israel in Gaza, and what concrete measures various stakeholders, including all of us here today, can take to stop what is happening. As a final point of order, I want to stress that we will be leaving 15 to 20 minutes for questions at the end of the panel and will not be taking audience contributions before that. So, to get into what we actually came here to talk about today. I'm going to turn to Matt first, and we're going to walk through a couple of aspects to get to those questions that I just mentioned. The first part and the first two questions that I want to talk about are really about what is actually happening from a technology point of view in Gaza, because I think some of you will be aware of certain things, some will not. So we're going to go through, and I want to start with, what is the precise role that digital technologies, and specifically those related to so-called artificial intelligence, as well as cloud computing, have been playing in the war on Gaza, and to what extent those technologies have been provided by companies such as Google, Amazon, Microsoft, also EU-based companies. So, Matt, many people in the audience will be familiar with long-standing debates about biometric surveillance in the EU, heated debates from the EU AI Act negotiations and Article 5 with its prohibitions. What people may know less about is how biometric surveillance is used by Israel in Palestine and the occupied territories. Given that this surveillance infrastructure, as we will see in a bit, forms the foundation for the AI systems that we're going to discuss, could you give us an overview of what your own investigations have revealed?
Thank you, Daniel. So as AI-driven surveillance in particular biometric recognition has formed part and parcel of regimes of control deployed by Israeli authorities in the occupied Palestinian territories for the better part of 4 decades. There's a lot to unpick here. Going back first to the early days of curating registries of Palestinians, the permit regime was once such first attempt at pulling together and centralizing mass collections of data on Palestinians, including biometric prints such as fingerprints. In the late 90s and early 2000s, Wolfpack, a database of largely analog information centralized across at least the West Bank, started to be used. The database contains information on Palestinian people, their relatives, any flags, such as whether they've been detained or previously or are known to be members of, for example, human rights defender groups or political groups. The system essentially operates through, for example, a soldier somewhere pulling someone out of a crowd or detaining them by other means, and then holding them up in front of a CCTV camera on the street, calling in an operator who would then provide details manually on the individual in question. Since this, the system has been upgraded significantly. In 2022, Elizabeth Dwoskin explored and exposed really the Blue Wolf and White Wolf systems, which are used by the Israeli occupation forces in the West Bank. With the Blue Wolf system, Palestinians in, for example, Hebron, could now be identified using a smartphone app on a soldier's phone with a simple snapshot. So to operationalize the app, and to keep it expansive, Israeli occupation soldiers were incentivized to take as many pictures of Palestinian faces in Hebron as possible, carrying out intelligence raids, often in the middle of the night, lining up families, including children, to register their faces in the Blue Wolf system. Soldiers were actually instructed that the units with the most amount of faces captured would be rewarded with gift cards, holidays, and the like, gamifying the occupation and apartheid against Palestinians in further reinforcing their dehumanization. In 2022 to 2023, Amnesty International exposed how a new system, Red Wolf, pulls together information from Wolfpack and Blue Wolf to automate arbitrary restrictions on the freedom of movement. The system works at checkpoints. For example, checkpoint 56 near Tel Romeda in H2 in Hebron, where a red, yellow, and green light system facing an Israeli soldier inside the checkpoint determines whether Palestinians, specifically those who live in the neighborhood, can move in and out of their communities, a necessity to access work, education, medical services, and family life. If you've been flagged previously, for example, participating in protest, being a human rights defender, or having been previously arrested, it's likely that the system will flag you as red and not let you pass until you've been further interrogated or taken into custody. If a biometric record is not held on you or the system fails to recognize you due to a technical error, and we know that facial recognition systems in particular are prone to bias and errors, the system will not let you pass. And even if the soldiers who know residents that come and go find themselves essentially having to defer to the systems, arbitrarily preventing Palestinians in Hebron from living their life without a permanent reminder of an occupation that is creeping into de facto annexation. By further imparting arbitrary restrictions on the freedom of movement, on the right to freedom of movement, not to mention the discriminatory nature of the system itself, which is based only on Palestinians, and its mass surveillance properties gathering up as much information on Palestinians, biometric systems like these are reinforcing apartheid in the West Bank. In the occupied city of East Jerusalem, Mabat 2000, which is a 24/7 system of network CCTV surveillance, has also been deployed since 2000. Around 2018, the system was upgraded to support facial recognition, which has since been used to harass, arbitrarily detain, and watch the movements of Palestinians in the illegally annexed city. People have been pulled out of crowds and arrested, with families and relatives subjected to chilling reminders of what will happen to them should they dare to engage in expressing their internationally guaranteed rights. Many of the cameras that are being used for these systems are manufactured by TKH Group, a Dutch surveillance manufacturer. In Siloam, a neighborhood of the Old City, communities are subject to Mabat 2000 through towering camera poles in the center of the communities, looking out towards the homes of Palestinians. Illegal Israeli settlers, meanwhile, have been excavating under these homes under the auspices of finding sites of biblical significance, which in turn, as forensic architecture in particular has shown, is leading to the collapse of Palestinian homes and the takeover by illegal settlers. As this process unfolds, settlers situate their own surveillance infrastructure, supplied in heavy amounts by the Chinese surveillance manufacturer Hikvision, on the outer edges of the community, forming together with the Mabat 2000 system a double panopticon. Palestinians in Hebron are actively having to change how they move in the neighborhood. Palestinians in Silwan have to actively change how they move in the neighborhood, whether they're visiting in either site particular relatives or friends, subject to whether they've been flagged by the system. Some have moved out of the neighborhood entirely in Silwan. In this way, we see how demolitions and illegal settlements activity begets surveillance, and how surveillance in turn begets illegal settlement activity. AI-driven surveillance, or biometric surveillance in this case, not only reinforces apartheid through arbitrary restrictions on the freedom of movement, which is a crime under international law, but also through, for example, in East Jerusalem, forming part and parcel of a system of coercion that is intended to force Palestinians out of areas of strategic interest to Israeli authorities and settlers, which moves us closer to the crime of forcible transfer. So when we see biometric surveillance deployed to slow down and arbitrarily harass Palestinians moving from the north to the south of Gaza on the back of a genocidal campaign, when we see target acquisition systems rendering 37,000 targets based on surveillance data from social media profiles, websites, existing databases, and other proxy data, we're reminded that these systems are intentional and have been used in the occupied territory at large before. They're not there to guarantee the security of Israel. They are part and parcel of AI-driven reinforcement of international grave crimes that continue to go with impunity.
I would say fantastic. Your presentation was fantastic, but what you described is absolutely horrific. Thank you, Matt. Moving to Marwa, so we've already heard Matt lay out this groundwork of biometric surveillance, and I want to talk now about the AI systems. And what precise AI systems are being used, it's so different, I think, to what people imagine when they think about AI in warfare. It's not this killer robots type approach. And I was recently reading an interview in the VRT, the Dutch broadcaster, with Dirk Moses, a leading scholar of genocide at the City College of New York. And one of the things that struck me, so this was a kind of non-tech related publication, general interest, his specialty, to what I know, is not tech focused. And he specifically mentioned the use of AI targeting systems by Israel, and in particular one with the repulsive name, Where is Daddy, as being central to his conviction that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, specifically in how they'd crossed the line from legitimate conduct of war into criminal activity. So could you explain what these AI systems are? And just for the technical side of the panel, Mara will be using a PowerPoint presentation, if we could get that on the screen. And yeah, why someone like Dirk Moses would see these as key to the allegation that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I appreciate the framing of the question, because it is important to know that these tools deployed are, as Matt said, part and parcel of state policy to commit those crimes. So they are really intended to do what they are supposed to do. So I'm using this for the first time. Yeah, I will go through the systems that we know of, because Israel has been toying and testing AI tech for many years. We know in 2021, the first time the IDF came out bragging about the first AI-enabled war during their bombardment campaign of Gaza in May 2021. And some of the systems that we know of today, and they got a lot of attention because of the investigation and obviously the level of atrocity that is happening in Gaza, were in fact mentioned in 2021. So I guess over the years, they really perfected those systems. And now we see the full-scale mass slaughter because of them. So one of those systems is what a 9/7/2 investigation called a mass assassination factory. It's called the Gospel, or Hasbara in Hebrew. And the system basically processes enormous amounts of data, tens of thousands of intelligence officers could not process, and then recommends bombing sites in real time. So it's a system that tells Israeli soldiers whether an X building is to be targeted. And here, target generation is an interesting word. It's an oxymoron because Israel's stated goal, okay, has been, as said by the IDF spokesperson multiple times, and as early as October 10th, 2023, that emphasis is on damage and not on accuracy. I want to mention this up front because it's important to dispel the myth that perhaps you could hear from ministries of defense or military officers or some arguments out there that say that AI actually helps the Israeli military or maybe other military to ensure that their conduct of war is proportionate and targeted. Where in fact these AI systems, powered by cloud computing tech provided by big tech companies, have facilitated mass slaughter and destruction while cutting red tape for Israeli officers and their subordinates. Another system is Lavender, which is tied to Where is Daddy, and I'll explain in a bit how these two work. So Lavender basically allows the Israeli army to process the information or the data of the 2.3 million Palestinians living in Gaza in order to generate kill lists. And those kill lists, or once you've identified as a target, Where is Daddy comes where those targets are monitored and tracked in real time. And once they enter their home with their families, they are bombed. The Lavender system was deployed in the very beginning of the war. The Israeli army, according to the investigation, completely relied on Lavender, almost completely relied on Lavender in the first few weeks, and it clocked as many as targets as around 36 or 37,000. Soldiers, or the system itself, it uses different data points collected through mass surveillance, and every single person in Gaza is rated from 0 to 100 on the likelihood of them being a Hamas militant or a member of the military wing of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. I do want to say that, as I said, like those are the systems we know of. There has been some mentions to systems that are nameless at this point, which the Israeli army uses AI to also calculate the number of people or calculate collateral damage. So, for example, an AI system tells them how many people are living in an X building once it's bombed. And can you imagine in Gaza right now, where people have been displaced up to 10 times or even more, and families tend to huddle together, the Israeli officers, where in the past they'd had to go through identifying the target, verifying intelligence information to see, okay, this target is indeed like to be assassinated, and then understanding how many people live in that building and therefore how many people would be killed. All of that is now automated, and as a result, families are being killed. And in fact, thousands of families at this point, entire families, have been wiped out from the civil register altogether. The problem, now I'm going to run some quotes as I share more about those systems from the Israeli officers that use these systems to just show how abhorrent those systems are. So first, not only soldiers were pressed to generate as many targets as possible, again, accelerating a crime and a state policy. They were told that the outcomes you get from Lavender or Gospel, you have to treat as an order or as if they were made by a human decision. They were also, so they don't have to check anything. The only check that they need to do is just for 20 seconds to check if the target is male or not, which is also a very twisted notion of like, if you're male, then automatically you're a terrorist and therefore you can be killed. Also, soldiers said that the training of this data itself of Lavender and who is considered to be Hamas are problematic to begin with. Because, for example, your communications pattern, let's say, for example, you keep changing phone numbers, that is seen as an indicator that you are Hamas militant. But if you are living in Gaza at this point where there's no electricity, no energy, no fuel, and you're just running for your life, the chances are of you using a phone of your relative or changing numbers is quite common, and as a result, people have been killed because the system saw or ranked them as a likely Hamas militant. The error rate of the lavender has been stated as 10%, which is quite insane, and that's why we have said that those systems need to be banned, because the consequences are irredeemable and irreversible. You can't basically bring people back from death. And to make even matters worse, the Israeli army decided that for some junior Hamas militants, it's not really worth it to spend expensive bombs on. So they use, for example, what they call unguided missiles or dumb bombs, which can cause huge damage. They're not targeted, to drop it on top of a building, again, killing an entire families that have nothing to do with Hamas, just innocent civilians. There also, with Where is Daddy, there are sometimes gaps in real-time tracking. So to the system, this person, they arrived at their home and therefore they can drop the bomb now, where in fact, in real life, the person hasn't arrived. Again, as a result, tens, if not hundreds of families and innocent people have been killed as a result. Now, I want to mention and build on what Matt said, 3 important points that should frame our discussion. And forgive me if I'm stating the obvious, because sometimes in these discussions it feels like you have to explain those ABCs. But even though these systems are grabbing headlines now and a lot of attention, they are in fact the culmination of an entire architecture that is built on and powered through mass surveillance, which results in the gamification of killing and also allows to dehumanize people and reduce them to data points that you can kill at the press of a button. And that's what a lot of soldiers said, that again, if the machine is, you're not sure if the machine is right, but that's statistically fine. And if the machine said, it was a cold decision, so to speak. The second point I want to mention is that a critical pillar of this architecture is non-sophisticated technology. And as abhorrent and shocking these technologies are, they are, in fact, what my colleague Daniel and I had argued, that they are, in fact, non-sophisticated and quite mundane. And at their very heart, they're systems that have been already deployed around the world by different governments, different departments, different private actors, systems that are known as predictive policing. It's the system, used by a bank to decide whether you are eligible for a loan, or by law enforcement to whether a person might be a likely criminal, are the same systems used by Israel to decide whether a person is a Hamas militant and therefore deserve to be killed. And the third point I want to emphasize on, as we've long learned as a Palestinian, many Palestinian scholars have said that Palestine has been a laboratory. It's a backyard for Israel to experiment and test its technologies, which then, of course, markets and sells. And therefore, it's important to keep in mind that this is not something that is just happening offshore and could soon also be replicated in other contexts, especially as the very person who headed the intelligence unit in the Israeli army, Unit 8200, that developed these technologies, had publicly stated that his vision in life is to take those systems from the periphery and deliver them to center of the stage. And that's something that the Israeli military tech complex, if you look at the drone industry, if you look at other military industries, and connect their revenues and profits generated, especially during these cycles of war, you immediately understand the risk of those becoming commercialized and sold. And what makes it even worse, as Daniel alluded to in his introductory remarks, now we see companies themselves also signaling their interest in deploying their tech on their side for military application. Google being one company that has used Project Nimbus, according to Google tech workers, in which they said that contract in itself, which provides the first national cloud region for a country, has been seen as a testing ground of how much, where can Google provide similar services to other countries. And of course, lo and behold, during this war and in the beginning of this year, Google discarded one of its self-claimed principles that it had since 2018, in which it dropped a principle it had for itself that it will not allow the use of its AI technologies for military applications. Now, of course, they're officially open for business. And in March, they signed a partnership with Lockheed Martin, one of the biggest military or defense contractors in the world. So I will leave with these, I will stop at these 3 points to keep in mind, and I'll pass it back to you, Daniel.
Great, thank you, Mara. And I think there's a huge amount. There's a huge amount that we can come back to later also in the questions with the audience. And yeah, just to underline that, it's worth looking up what Google dropped from their ethics principles. I've spent years making fun of their ethics principles. And it's really like the most egregious basic stuff. We will not pursue weapons or other technologies whose principal purpose or implementation is to cause or directly facilitate injury to people. This is where we are in 2025, that they're dropping that from voluntary ethics principles. Great. So I think we understand a bit more, what's on the ground, what's being used. You've hopefully been shocked by what you've heard, but what's also emerged from what we've heard so far is that none of this is being done in isolation. We've heard about Project Nimbus, and in the next question, what I want to do is turn to Sarah and to sort of delve a bit more into the partnerships, the university collaborations, funding, exports, imports, all of this side of things that's also enabling these technologies to be developed, because precisely they are not being developed in isolation. So Sarah, could you inform us a bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. So I think the basis of understanding the technology is really important to take a step back a little bit and think about how, as us people here living in the EU and paying taxes here, how is the EU complicit in all of this? How are we, as people paying taxes, forced to be complicit in this? And also, specifically, what is the price tag on tech-facilitated genocide in Gaza? So Matt and Mahwa have made the really good point that this is also the technology piece here is part and parcel of a broader political and also financial support to genocide that I think we have to recognize. The technology funding is part of the conversation, but also much more broadly, I think, first of all, we have to understand what political support and what financial support does the EU offer to genocide in Gaza and also before. The first thing I'd really like to touch upon is the question of exports more generally before we go into the technology. So the EU is the second largest arms supplier to Israel after the US. And according to the figures of the EU's own External Action Service, just between the years of 2018 to 2022, EU member states sold arms worth 1.7 billion euros to Israel. The Transnational Institute also did a study last year looking at specifically 2024, and it showed that European taxpayers' money to the tune of 426 million euros was funding companies that arm Israel, just arms specifically. So a little bit of context on exports. But then also the question of imports. So roughly 25% of Israel's defense exports are going to European countries. And Israeli companies regularly market, as Mahwa said, their products on the basis of them being battle tested, which I think is one of the most egregious sort of indications of the state we're in now, which is essentially that this death, this automated killing, by design is used as a basis for European states to not just procure, but also politically endorse what is happening. Crucially, I think it's important also to recognize that this is part and parcel of a broader political dynamic of war militarization. So in the same way as the EU is participating, the EU and its member states are participating in the sale and import of such technologies and weapons to, for use on Palestine. Also similarly, Israeli companies participate and profit from the EU's own internal war, specifically its border militarization project. So for a while now, we have known that Frontex, which is the European Union's border and coastal guard agency, leases drones from Israeli companies Elbit Systems and the Israeli aerospace industries for surveillance and monitoring of the Mediterranean. And I'll come back to this because it's an important recognition of, many of you might have been hearing from Mahwa's and Matt's speech, many of the techniques being used, predictive policing, biometric surveillance, they're things that we work on here in Europe too. Not only is there a shift in terms of the actual equipment used, there's also a vast system of knowledge production and knowledge transfer that is not only aiding these practices, but also is a very important gateway to Israeli arms companies, Israeli security companies being able to access EU research funding, which we'll come back to. So specifically, these connections we do need to make between predictive policing systems, biometric systems, both in Palestine and here in Europe. And the border militarization is one of the clearest examples of that. Going to research funding, I think, is a really important one, and I think is because of the transparency requirements in terms of where EU funding goes to, we do know more than in other cases, a lot of the examples of EU companies and collaborations with Israel universities accessing EU funding for some of the things that Mahwa and Matt have talked about. So one of the main programs that you might have heard of, Horizon Europe, which for the last budgetary cycle, the whole program is around 95 billion accessible. Israel and Turkey are the only non-EU member states that have access to that pot of money, which is already a system of exceptionalism in itself. And we have found that although Horizon is not supposed to fund military uses, it's been repeatedly found to support military uses through a concept of dual use. So specifically, in the last 10 years, the arms lobby and the arms industry have specifically lobbied, instead of using a term of militarism, use the term of security. And through this way, by also proposing projects, also proposing strands of work that focus on civilian areas, like border control, logistical and disaster relief support, and also general surveillance capacity, have been able to access funding for the development of technologies that are now also used in a military context. So funding that is supposed to be for research and innovation is used for militarism, and for many of the types of technologies we've heard about. So since the Israeli attacks began on Gaza in 2023, specifically in this time period, the EU has provided over 238 million to Israeli institutions for research and innovation, most notably some of which include projects that fund arms companies such as the Israel aerospace industries. And in 2024, Statewatch and IMI found that the company Extend, which is a drone manufacturer supporting the Israeli Defense Force, then only supporting the Israeli Defense Force, now publicly stating that they 100% only support the Israeli Defense Force. They received a research and development grant from the EU's Horizon Europe Fund. Another example, Al Jazeera last year investigated that under Horizon, Bar Ilan University in Israel and the Israeli Ministry of Public Security received almost 1.5 million euros to develop an interrogation training simulator for use in the occupied territories. So these are just some examples, and we can access them publicly. Some of the examples, especially for larger companies like Elbit Systems, information is not as publicly accessible, even though, again, this is EU taxpayers' money being used for this, often obfuscated by a mixture of excuses, including trade secrecy and confidentiality. So the information isn't fully out there. And although there have been allegations around Lavender and some of the other AI-generated of EU complicity in those sorts of systems that have not necessarily been substantiated yet because of those reasons. A little bit taking a step back, so all of this preceded October 7th, and criticism started back in 2015 by the ECCP, so the European Coordination of Committees and Association for Palestine. They called out that Israeli arms companies were benefiting from EU research funding, already against this broader backdrop of occupation, military, police, and settler violence against the Palestinians. And in a number of projects, funding still was provided for the development of tech infrastructures for monitoring borders, checkpoints, barriers, all of which was a necessary part of the settlement expansion, occupation, surveillance, and containment of Palestinians. So again, these systems and the broader knowledge production around them has informed also the EU's border militarization project. And Israeli participation in things like border militarization has been a gateway for them to access EU research funding by saying that they are not only focusing on military uses, which otherwise would have banned as a way of access to EU funding. So these are just a few examples, and I want to take a little bit of a step back to say that it's clear that the EU and its member states are funding this genocide, and therefore our taxpayer money is doing so too. But also specifically, I think there's a broader ideological and political question here about the use of this technology that I think we need to reckon with a little bit. It's not just the actual financial support, and it's not just only the institutional political support, but there's also a broader question of what does it mean to use AI or broader technologies in the support of a genocide? And I think one is a masking politics. So security as a frame has been used as a front for militarism, and has been a way to reduce the death politics of what these technologies has been used for by framing it as something as security when it is actually war. Secondly, technology and infrastructural provision, like some of the use cases Mahwa has mentioned around Project Nimbus and the cloud, they also shift some of these conversations into sort of like a more mundane area of logistics, which provide this cloak of objectivity around what is essentially political and technical support to genocide. And I think that's something that we really need to bear in mind when we have a discussion about AI facilitated militarism, some of which are the automated target generation and actually things akin to weapons of war, and others are much more broader technological infrastructural support that provide the basis for genocidal activity. Another cloak of objectivity. And then lastly, a dynamic that I think we will go into a little bit more is that together we see how increasingly big tech and security and arms companies collaborate, and that complex cannot really be separated anymore. That is inherently connected. The normative power of AI, and which we very much know in a space like this, has been a way to expand an AI-based military complex through a guise of broadly neutral idea of national security, which is becoming increasingly hegemonic in US politics and increasingly here in Europe. And that's something I think we need to address and come back to.
Amazing. Thank you for that, Sarah. And I think we're deep into the demystification of what's happening here on many levels. And I think whenever we're talking about AI, it's constantly this process of basically dealing with complete bullshit that we're hearing and then pulling back the layers to understand what's actually happening, and we've done that now in a few layers. The types of systems we're talking about, I recently heard an anecdote about one of these organizations with future in its title, rolling out a robot dog with an automated weapon on its back that it had hooked up to a chatbot, and how they got it to talk in front of an audience about, I do not make moral calculations when I kill people. And the discrepancy between that vision of the dangers of AI versus the mundane banality of evil, like the bureaucratic aspect to it that we've heard about here, is massive. And it takes a lot of work to get to understanding what is actually happening through AI here. So I think we've got to that point in the conversation, and now where I want to move to is the legal aspect. So I want to turn to Lydia. And what's been interesting, and I think many of us have experienced, is when news attention started to turn to the use of AI systems in Gaza to the minor extent that it did. I had questions coming from people, oh, but what about the EU AI Act? What about the Council of Europe's AI Treaty? And, you know, we've been bombarded with these groundbreaking treaties, regulations, etc., on AI that actually don't have much to do with what's going on here. And I think, you know, we're at a point where we're under, Israel is a signatory of the Council of Europe Treaty, by the way, which says everything you need to know, I think. But because we've seen how it's actually a lot of quite mundane stuff that's happening here, and it's physical hardware, it's provision of cloud computing services, all of this stuff. I want us to start to look at which legal instruments actually apply. And so the question to you, Lydia, is can you explain to us what the obligations of EU states, companies, even individuals are to prevent the ongoing genocide, and more particularly how that relates to the provisions of things such as cloud computing services or other AI technologies?
Yeah, thank you. Well, we are talking about this in the context of the genocide. There's a wider context of occupation, so I'll unpack a little bit what the legal implications of both those realities are. To start with the genocide. So we have a genocide convention, and there's a lot of, well, I don't know, depending on which country you're from, you may have been hearing a lot of debate around whether or not it is a genocide. I think there's consensus among expert scholars, human rights organizations, but even if there wasn't, it wouldn't matter, because the whole point of coming into existence of the Genocide Convention is prevention. So the Genocide Convention wasn't drafted with the purpose of being able to punish after the crime of genocide had been completed. Rather, it said the purpose of it was never again. So we want to have an instrument that we can use, that we can apply, so that this will never occur again. Not to be able to punish perpetrators in the future. So that is, yeah, that is why the hair in the back of my neck stands up when there's a debate. It doesn't matter. We need to be doing everything we can to prevent and to stop genocide. For states, that means, and this has been decided by the International Court of Justice, the highest international court in a trial that was around the Bosnia genocide. It determined that it was the obligation of states, so third states included, to undertake, to prevent and punish, and to employ all means reasonably available to them to prevent genocide to the extent possible. So all means reasonably available, and I'll get into a little bit of detail about what I think that should mean in relation to tech and AI. But to start, to clarify, it doesn't mean that any single third state, like Belgium, like the Netherlands, like UK, would have the obligation to prevent, as such, the genocide. That's not in their power. They have to do everything they can that is in their power. So what does that mean in relation to tech? It means that the record, for example, I mean, it means a lot of things. One thing it should mean is that from the moment the state becomes aware of the risk of a genocide, so I would argue that was the 8th or the 7th of October, all signs were red, but even if that hadn't been a moment, it would definitely have been the moment from 26 January of last year onwards, when the ICJ issued provisional measures in the case that was brought by South Africa against Israel. In those provisional measures, or in that ruling rather, the court said that it is plausible that Israel is committing acts of genocide in Gaza. That at least that would have been a moment where the obligation to do everything to prevent would have kicked in. Yeah, Sarah, you spoke a little bit about the secrecy and all the different ways in which the information is kept hidden from us. What are the contracts exactly? What is going where exactly? Civil society, media, and your average citizen may not have access to the information, but states do. So from the moment they become aware of the risk of a genocide possibly being committed against the people, they have the customs records, they have all the registrations and the filings of companies. They need to get to work. So they need to actively shift into gear, do everything they can to see and understand who is supplying the material support for the acts that are being carried out by the Israeli occupation forces. I yet have to see an example of where that has happened, but it is something that I think we should all be pushing for. Also, so action towards companies that are involved, investigate them, prosecute them, but also warning, do not get involved. Here is your briefing on what you need to know about your legal risks, about your responsibilities as a company, and what may happen to you if you do decide to get involved in this market space. States also have, they're not only home states of corporations that are exporting products and services, they may also be involved as economic actors themselves. So actively involved in certain deals, buying, selling. That is where state responsibility may also come in a more direct sense, that they may be, in the future, held to account for their own economic transactions that have contributed to the genocide. Moving to individuals. Individuals have been, in the past, individual corporate agents, corporate executives, have been convicted for their role in aiding and abetting acts of war crimes, acts of genocide. So this happened after the Holocaust. In the Nuremberg tribunals, corporate executives were prosecuted and convicted for their contribution, their material support in the killings of the Holocaust. And in more recent history, there have been 2 cases, for example, pulling out some experiences from the Netherlands. One Dutch businessman was convicted for his complicity in war crimes in Liberia because he was involved in a scheme that allowed weapons to reach Charles Taylor. He was convicted for that. Another Dutch businessman, Frans van Anraat, he was supplying chemical components that were processed into chemical weapons that were used by Saddam Hussein to kill the Kurds, to conduct massacres. Also, Frans van Anraat was convicted as complicit in those war crimes. And under Dutch law, there is also the possibility to hold to account for complicity in war crimes, companies as such. So we yet have to see that happen, but it is both are possible. So it depends on the jurisdiction you're in, whether a company could be held liable for international crimes, war crimes, genocide, but individuals absolutely can be held to account. At an international stage, there's the International Criminal Court that only has jurisdiction over individuals, and up until now, the reality has been that only military and political leaders have been prosecuted. But it is very clear from the founding statute, the Rome Statute, that this is not an exclusive, this is not exhaustive. The political and military leadership are some possibility of prosecution, but where a corporate leader has the authority and carries the responsibility, he or she may also well be held to account. So these debates around where the prosecutor should go are happening. I would hope that it is only a matter of time before corporate executives face the accountability and the responsibility that comes with their actions. Maybe I could mention a few more examples if there's time. Apologies. I'll elaborate on a few more Dutch examples. So we have actually, we meaning 3 Palestinian human rights organizations and 7 Dutch civil society organizations, including SOMO, have launched a civil case against the Dutch state for its failure to prevent genocide in Gaza. And one element is to do with the export licenses of weapons parts, that we think it should have been stopped. We discovered 2 days ago new export licenses were issued as recently as January. So that has to stop. The same would apply to things that are not classified or listed as arms. We could argue technology is very much falls into the category. We found proof that the Netherlands is an important source country for dogs that are being used by the Israeli occupation army. That should stop. And although under law currently, there's no sanctions, there's nothing that specifically prohibits the exporting of dogs, police dogs, working dogs to the Israeli army. But there is something called genocide, the obligation to prevent genocide. There is international humanitarian law. So with that court case, we are saying the Dutch state should use any means necessary to stop those dogs from reaching the army. If it cannot apply for whatever reason, if it doesn't apply a blanket prohibition, it should put these dogs on the EU, it should apply the EU dual-use licensing regime to these dogs. So I think this is the EU dual-use regime is probably quite relevant for technology, for artificial intelligence. The EU dual-use licensing regime, or regulation rather, is meant to deal with those products that could have, besides civilian applications, military applications. I think if nothing else, the Gaza genocide has shown that what AI is capable of and how it can be key, core and instrumental in atrocity crimes. So everything depends on the risk. If the risk exists that a produce can be used in an atrocity crime, in human rights violations, a state has to act, and it has to say, we need to either ban it or we need to subject it to an export license requirement so that we can check before it goes anywhere outside of our jurisdiction. If you speak to your authorities or government, you will probably hear, if you're based in the EU, yes, well, we need EU consensus around this. We need to be speaking with the other states. We need to build consensus and see whether other EU states can align so that we put this on an EU dual-use list. That is not necessary. There's an exemption in the EU dual-use regulation that allows for individual member states to assess the risk and, where necessary, take steps and say, we will apply unilaterally, proactively, we will apply this EU dual-use license requirement for our jurisdiction. We're not going to wait for the EU to agree on this. That should have been the case in Gaza from the get-go. It hasn't happened. So I think this is definitely worth having more conversations around. What can we do to really effectively prevent these goods, these services and products to reach the army? We don't have to wait for a consensus level, for states to take action. Maybe I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, great. Sounds like some people should be worried. Definitely. Just one open question to the panelists before we open up to the audience. I think, one of the most egregious aspects of, what's been happening in Gaza from here is the absolute lack of action, is the apathy that we've seen, and especially when it's contrasted with what happened in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when we saw stakeholders across the board do everything that they could to put pressure. Sanctions, everything, whatever kind of action people were able to take, people seem to be taking. And it's exactly the opposite that's been happening with Gaza. So I want to sort of ask you, and it's come back many times, what can we do here today? What can you, I don't know, you work for a tech company, you're in a university, I don't know what exactly role you have, but what could you do? So a sort of a broader question on what are the strategies, what are the leverage points that can be used to challenge and resist complicity in this tech-facilitated war on Gaza? And what can people in this room even here being doing? And to come back to the theme of CPDP, the world is watching. So what can we be doing? Anyone would like to?
I can start by saying it's not only lack of action, it's the complete normalization of those practices. I mean, imagine amidst all of this horror and piles of documentation and investigation, the European Commission decides in January last year that Israel has such strong and robust data protection safeguards that it's seen as an adequate partner for data transfers, and therefore its adequacy decision has been renewed. That not only normalizes and rewards, in fact, Israel's mass surveillance practices as a surveillance state, but effectively it also says that apartheid is fine because Israel, for example, says that we don't have any responsibilities to respect human rights in the occupied territories. We're only responsible for applying international law in Israel proper. And that's actually a point that the Commission had said in its first adequacy decision in 2011, that this assessment is only made in regards to Israeli laws and Israel proper and not to the occupied territories, whether Palestine and or the Syrian Golan, which is a conclusion that the UN Human Rights Committee, that's the body responsible for interpreting the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, have completely abolished. It said, actually, Israel, as an occupying power, has an obligation to ensure that its responsibilities to defend and protect human rights applies to Palestinians. So they're normalizing not only surveillance, but again, this policy of apartheid, that it's fine to sponsor, to surveil every aspect of an entire population and use their data to kill them en masse, because there is a strong data protection law in Israel that only applies to Israelis. That needs to stop. And the second point I want to mention is that, as you said, indeed, we know from other contexts that the EU has the tools it needs in order to stop atrocity crimes and genocide, including, for example, in response to Bashar al-Assad's brutal repression in 2011, the EU levied a number of sanctions. One of the European Council sanctions were related to the banning and prohibition of the direct or indirect sale and export of technologies and software that may be used for internal repression and for surveillance. Something that, of course, we have not seen, and probably it will take us maybe a few years to see. It's a question of political will and political will, and I think it's the same dynamic that we faced here in our panel, in which, you know, Palestine always becomes an exception to states' obligations and upholding human rights, which we see play out differently in other contexts.
And just following up on that, naming it, let's recognize the racial politics of this as well. Why is this exceptionalism existing around Gaza, and it doesn't apply to the EU's response to other wars, let's say. Carrying on from the point about the adequacy decision, there's also another important political instrument that we need to think about. So the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which is the trade, governs the trade, economic cooperation, and political dialogue between the EU and Israel, has been enforced since 2000, legitimizing in many ways, economically and politically, genocide occupation for a very long time now. Has come under criticism from many NGOs for a year and a half, saying, why are we complicit, especially considering the genocide. Currently, since the last 2 or 3 days, is under review from EU diplomats, from the highest EU diplomats, actually spearheaded by the Dutch government, put on the table. So pressure is working in many ways, and I think a year ago, would I have ever thought that the EU-Israel Association Agreement might be under review? No. So pressure works, and there are many things that we can do. So suspending that agreement is one of our first demands that we can be made, especially for those of us that are doing advocacy to the EU institutions. We should not be complicit through trade or in any other means. Number 2, we talked about funding a lot. EU should be banned from accessing funding from Horizon Europe. I think that's a clear demand, and why should our taxpayers' money be spent funding genocide, tech-based or others? Similarly, many of you will be working on the advocacy around the EU budget now, which will be setting the political terms and the actual broad budget for programs like the Horizon Europe. That is a question that can and should be put on the table. Funding for wars, funding for genocide, and specifically in Israel. Again, arms embargo now, including on the tech, and that's something that we need to be demanding, politically organizing for, advocating for in any circumstance that we get, and it's something very concretely we can do either to EU institutions, to local government, to national government. We can be doing that in many other different contexts, and that can be done through organizations, through collectives, as individuals in many contexts. Lastly, for many of us in this room, we work for universities, for NGOs, don't collaborate. The funding that is accessed through Horizon, but also through in other spheres, often is in collaboration. CPDP collaborates with the Haifa Center for Law and Technology. Why? Why would we collaborate? And that is just the minimum that we can do, is not collaborate with Israel. So in short, resist at all costs, and resist not just exceptionalizing Israel, but also neutralizing the genocide through technology. Recognize that the technology is absolutely central tool towards this end, and it serves to obfuscate, to mask, to regulate, to relegate to the purely operational, the practice of enabling murder and the extermination of the Palestinian people. And so rather than neutralize, of course, as we've heard, this tech can actually supercharge this murder, and we need to be paying attention to that.
To add a little bit onto this, there are a number of spheres within tech production as well in which we've seen a lot of engagement with disruption, which is crucial. It's not just raising noise and it going nowhere. We've seen tech workers in particular refusing to continue working on the development of, for example, cloud infrastructure, Google workers, Microsoft Azure workers, Cisco workers. What this does is not simply just, again, create noise. What it actually does, it creates knowledge of the crime in question with the company and with the senior executives in the company. So when legal cases start ramping up, they cannot claim that they didn't know. The issue and the concerns were raised by the employees of the company. They were raised by human rights organizations. They were raised by special rapporteurs. So what other avenue do they have to go to claim ignorance? They can't. And we've seen now that legal cases are starting to happen, that, legal aid clinics that together with rights organizations and tech workers themselves are pursuing domestic cases against the companies in the places in which states have jurisdiction over big tech companies. These are some really strategic ways of engaging with ensuring that states aren't wound up with contributing to genocide, but are in fact wound up with preventing it. So tech workers leading and contributing to disruption, union workers, and in particular academic unions as well, working on exposing investment portfolios of various universities, which Sarah also alluded to here, and ensuring that they know that this could also be considered a way of contributing to economic activity that generates genocide. But just a final point there as well. We don't even need the crime of genocide to occur for these problems to stand. As Lydia said before, as soon as we became aware that in fact there was a risk, the alarm bell should have rung. But even before then, let's remember the unlawful nature of the apartheid system and the crime of apartheid that precedes genocide. That this should also be considered when dealing with data and data processing systems related to Palestinians. And the apartheid has been standing for much longer than the genocide. So if you know or suspect that your company or institution is producing technology or cloud infrastructure or what have you that is supporting the Ministry of Defense in imparting its policies of apartheid and genocide and occupation and illegal annexation and dehumanization against Palestinians in the occupied territory, shout it out loud. Get it on record. Write them letters. That's it.
Yeah, very much want to echo what Matt just laid out. It's not a question of whether companies and corporate executives will be held to account. I think the question is only when. So cases are underway. Other examples from other sectors are already happening. For example, Booking.com has a criminal complaint against it in the Netherlands for laundering the proceeds of war crimes. So there's no there's nothing neutral about tech or AI in the context of Israel-Palestine. It is all part and parcel of a system that is being imposed on Palestinians the way that was explained. Maybe just to elaborate slightly on what Matt said is, even if the starvation and killing in Gaza would stop today, we are still looking at an unlawful occupation in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. July last year, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion which was extremely clear. There's an apartheid system in place. The settlements in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, are unlawful, must be withdrawn, and the any military presence of Israel in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip is unlawful and must cease immediately. Now, there's an obligation on all states around the world to make that happen, because an occupying power isn't voluntarily going to relent that control after decades of having had that control. So what do we do about that? It means that we all do our homework to see where are the connections. So if you're in the tech sector, find out. If you're in journalism, find out. If you're in the political sphere, find out. And I think everyone has a way to contribute to the pressure points. But a very important thing you mentioned, Matt, I think is inform each other, but also inform those that are making the decisions, because it is about increasing the responsibility, the pressure, but also the evidence, because these are conscious business decisions. The decision is constantly to remain involved, to remain linked, to not disengage from those business relationships that are helping to maintain the occupation, apartheid, and to contribute to genocide. So I think we all have a role to play. Don't underestimate your individual and your collective roles. We're starting to see, I think, the cracks in the violent system, but a lot of work still needs to be done. So, yeah.
Great. We've got a bit of time for questions. Maybe we could collect 2 or 3 at once, and then.
Hi, everyone. I want to thank and congratulate the panelists for their integrity, their work, their persistence in seeing this panel through. It really was a fantastic job. So thank you for that. I'm curious to ask the panelists, what role is there for the EU? Because I've heard from Sarah's interventions that there is some collective action that could be persuasive at EU level, but equally, Lydia has flagged that maybe a good lever is member state individual unilateral action because of the constant roadblock of having to take action based on consensus across 27 member states. And I'd like to know your thoughts about that in light of the surging presence of defense companies in Brussels, the increasing lobbying expenditure. Many of them have registered new lobbyists this year to the European Parliament. They seem to be prioritizing the EU and Brussels specifically as opposed to national member states. So I'd like to know that combined with the EU defense plan published this year, flagging AI as a key area of opportunity and priority. What does that spell in terms of how the EU is going to try and take action against the crimes committed in Gaza?
Yeah, thanks again to the panelists. I was just kind of thinking about what was said about racial implications and also connecting the dots. So it was hard for me not to think about Sudan. And of course, in the Belgian context, hard for me not to think about Congo. And of course, the importance Congo plays for big tech. So I just wanted to say that. But besides that, this was already mentioned. Is it possible to talk more about how how the occupied territories is used as a testing ground of what is to come? The reason why I asked this question is because I'm thinking about the first Black Lives Matter way. 5 minutes left. So I was thinking about the first wave of Black Lives Matter when Marc Lamont Hill and people like Aja Monet went to the occupied territories in order for solidarity, first of all, but also because of Black folks and activists in the US seeing that a lot of what was being used in the occupied territories was being transferred to the US context. So I was wondering if you could talk about, maybe even speculate about the future of some of these technologies, especially Red Wolf, for example, being used to police racialized Black and brown bodies.
Maybe we'll take those two questions, because with the 5 minutes we probably won't get more, but who would like to, would anyone like to jump in on either one? Yeah? You want to go?
First of all, solidarity with the people of Sudan and the people of Congo and all victims of these abhorrent crimes. Honestly, there are so many concrete examples. We could spend the entire day here. But one example I always mention is, so I want to pick on point that Sarah mentioned. So Frontex uses Elbit Systems drones. The most two famous drones are Hermes 900 and Hermes 450. I don't have the statistics now, but they're among the most popular and in-demand drones worldwide. Elbit Systems drone and sales in this war has, in November 2023, so a month into the war, has increased by 11%. I don't even know what the profit percentage is now. But that is to say that during every war, their sales increase. The first time they deployed their drone was by the IDF, was during the war in Gaza of 2014. And if I'm not mistaken, it was Hermes 450. And the people that were killed by the drone were 4 children that were playing football on the beach. And the drone made the decision that those were Hamas militant because of their physical activity, because the kids were playing football, and then they went, I think the football was kicked into like some shack, and then they went into it, and then they were bombed and killed. And when the Israelis did an investigation, because every time there's public outrage, then they investigate themselves. And they actually hailed that attack as precise because it did what it's supposed to do, regardless whether, in fact, there were 4 children that were killed. That drone, again, was deployed for the first time in Gaza, and immediately after, its sales went up because Elbit Systems promoted that technology as battle-tested. And as in fact, if you go to those defense conferences, so you see Israeli salesperson showing brochures and whatnot, of demonstrating sometimes even live footage or demonstrating how the system works with the setting of a Palestinian village. And of course, the target is a Palestinian man. That's one example of many of how it shows the direct link between how technology is tested and then sold, the result of which we see in the context of Europe, where migrants are being killed in the sea or detained due to this surveillance, again, empowered by Israeli tech.
Yeah. Thank you, Marwa. Just to build a little bit on the piece of how these things expand, you mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests and the policing of Black Lives Matter communities in particular, I think, is in no small part following similar logics of carcerality as we see play out in the context of the occupied Palestinian territory. We know, for example, that facial recognition is being used at large in New York City and was used particularly to target Black Lives Matter protesters in 2020, 2021. We know now that these same systems of surveillance, which are rife mostly in communities that have more Black and brown community members, are also being used specifically in instances in which individuals have been reported for speaking Arabic, for speaking any foreign language, for being Black and brown, for being engaged in something that looked a little bit sus to some Karen in the room, and we see how those forms of policing, in particular in the context of, say, the Palestine protests that have been ongoing now, in which black and brown folk participated vigorously, that those same systems and logics of surveillance, detention, deportation, expulsion play out, right? So even if it's not specifically the same technology, it is similar logics. However, of course, there are technology transfers that are similar. Marwa mentioned Elbit. Elbit is also being used in the context of the U.S. southern border against undocumented immigrant communities, communities on the move. We're seeing how Usto, previously known as Anyvision, which is a facial recognition provider in Gaza, and also we're providing facial recognition in the West Bank before pulling out after Microsoft dropped their 40% stake in them. They've now renamed to Usto and are providing facial recognition in B2B contexts in the United States. We know Cubic Technologies, which is a military defense contractor, who also provides, by the way, the New York MetroCard system, is also doing military defense simulation for the police in both Israel and in the United States. So Israel's regime of carcerality is deep within us in so many ways.
And maybe to link some of this with the first question, I think it speaks to a broader need for us to have a contestation around this massive expansion of defense, of the defense industry and funding that will come specifically here in the EU in the next few years. Challenge that its legitimacy in general, as well as through the complicity in genocide and in other conflict like zones across the world as well. So challenging that, I think, is something that politically I really would love to see it more space dedicated to here in Brussels, where we actually see like a lot of that is going unquestioned. Challenges this from an abolitionist perspective. So why in the age of rampant austerity, why in the increasing homelessness context, why when many people live in poverty, are we ramping up defense spending when we could be looking to solve other social problems through that? And why are we sending arms to Israel? Question mark around that as well. And that is a linked question. Broadly to the point about EU v. national, member states is important, and some of these things, EU-Israel, can be done by qualified majority. EU budget has to be done unanimously. So national work has to go hand in hand with EU work.
Great. I think we could go on for quite a lot longer, but unfortunately time is up. Just join me in thanking these absolutely incredible panelists.